Hi, welcome back to the Reconciliation Project podcast, where we're formed by faith and informed by science. I'm Hunter.
And I'm Sam.
And in today's episode, we're going to be continuing our discussion on evolution. And today we'll be looking at a field of study that supports evolution, supposedly, very well, and that is homology. And homology overall is a study of similarity, and in biology, this refers to similarities in anatomical structure, genetic sequencing, etc. And you remember in 2 episodes ago, we talked about genetic similarities between organisms, and in last episode, we talked about those similarities in the early embryonic development. Today, we're going to be looking at the similarities on the macro scale, things that we can see with our eyes, seeing those similarities across different species just right there in front of us. So you want to start us off with that?
Absolutely, yeah. So homology is actually widely accepted and widely used by the scientific community as evidence of descent from a common ancestor. This comes into play mostly when we discuss a topic called phylogeny, which kind of fits in with homology. It's fairly similar, but it's the study of evolutionary relationships between organisms throughout history. So, for example, if you look at a phylogenetic tree, I'm sure some people have seen it, it almost looks like, I want to say like a March Madness bracket, where you have one that splits into 2, splits into 4, and so on and so forth. Now, in phylogenetic trees, it's not always that even. Sometimes you'll have one that splits into 5, or you'll have one that splits into 16, or there's only one that pops off of it. So there's a lot of difference there, but that kind of outlines common descent back to the quote-unquote starting point, which would be that common ancestor by this argument. The branches of a phylogenetic tree basically show splits in an evolutionary line, which corresponds to new groups. And depending on what that looks like, that can be a new structure, that can be new genetic sequencing if you're doing genetic sequencing with phylogeny, or it can even be new proteins. So that's really kind of all wrapped up into what phylogeny is.
Typically, these trees, if you look at one biology textbook, for example, usually these splits are due to either new species forming or new kinds altogether. And in the grand scheme of things, on the entire evolutionary timeline, you're looking at the origins of both species and different kinds. But on some, you're looking at just the emergence of certain kinds or certain species rather. For example, if you look at the phylogenetic tree or the phylogeny tree for equine, you'll see there's relation between all the breeds of horses we have today. You'll see relation between zebras, donkeys, I think mules is in there.
Antelope as well.
All of that with modern horses. And you'll see they all go back to a single point. And that's referring more towards specific species because they all fall in that equine category. But in a larger phylogeny tree, you'll see that that equine group is connected to various other groups as well. And as you said, all of those groups, they'll have their own common ancestors, and those common ancestors get linked all the way back to what's called the last universal common ancestor, which is thought to be a simple microbe.
Yeah, so when we're looking at these phylogenetic trees, we tend to see a couple of different things. Mainly 2 types of evolution that are happening. First being convergent evolution, which is where unrelated species develop similar traits in relative isolation from each other. What I mean by completely unrelated species is species that have deviated from each other much longer ago in evolutionary history. Their common ancestor was much, much, much farther in the past. The other thing we tend to see is divergent evolution. And in the phylogenetic tree, this is where the splits in these groups happen. This is usually due to new traits emerging in different populations.
So a good way to really think about this is the difference between convergent and divergent, because they sound similar. Convergent is, think if you're driving down the road and there's 2 lanes, and you get further down the road and it becomes 1 lane. Think of those 2 lanes as 2 separate species, and think of them having different structures, I guess the best way to put it. And as you get down to where it's 1 lane, think they both have that same or similar structure, a similar trait. So convergent, unrelated species, different traits, they kind of converge and they don't become 1 species, but they emerge similar traits at the same time.
Yeah, that's an important part. These don't become a single species. They don't merge together and become 1 group of organisms.
Yeah, they're still separate. They just emerge similar, or new traits arise in both, and both of those traits are very similar. And this happens because different groups living in the same type of environment. versus divergent evolution. So in divergent evolution, it's kind of the opposite. So one lane road becomes two. They have, like, think of the structure that looks similar and is similar, but has different functions emerge based on what species we're looking at.
Mm-hmm. And what environment we're looking at. Often where divergent evolution comes into play, whereas convergent evolution has, it's different organisms all in a relatively similar environment and therefore developing similar traits. Divergent evolution is the idea that, we had these organisms that are similar because they share a common ancestor much closer and further into the future or into the present than you would see in convergent evolution. So you have similar organisms, but they're in different environments. So they're developing different uses for a similar structure. We're talking about these structures a good bit, and right now we're kind of just referring to them as these structures, right? But quote unquote, these structures are different depending on whether you're talking about convergent evolution or divergent evolution. So let's get into some of that terminology. Convergent evolution, the structure that we're referring to is what's called an analogous structure. And again, this is referring to the similar traits that we're seeing between these unrelated groups. Again, they share similar functions, they look largely similar, but they're not from shared ancestry. Best examples, think of the difference between a bird wing and an insect wing. Birds and insects are nowhere close to each other on the evolutionary phylogenetic tree. However, they have different types of wings and they use them for flying. Similarly, if you look at shark fins and dolphin flippers, shark fins are all cartilaginous, the type of tissue that you find in your ear that's bendy or in the tip of your nose. Whereas dolphin flippers have bones, similar to what you would see in a human hand. So very different structures, but they're both used for swimming and guiding the animal through water. Where that becomes different is divergent evolution. The type of structure we're talking about when we're discussing divergent evolution is what's known as homologous structures. Now, these are parts that share evolutionary origin and have similar anatomy, but serve different functions. So for example, go back to the dolphin flippers for a moment. I just mentioned that they have bones in them that are very similar to what's in your human hand, right? That's actually kind of what we're looking at. The dolphin or whale flippers, human hands, maybe even bat wings, they all have finger-like bones called phalanges, and then the bits that are in what would be your lower palm called your metacarpals. All of those bones are present in bat wings, human hands, dolphin flippers, whale flippers. They have slightly different orientation, but they're very similar in structure. And what we see happen there is they're used for various different things. Bat wings are used for flying. Human hands are used for tool use and grasping at things, what have you. Whale and dolphin flippers are used for swimming.
So I think the best way to look at this overall is with convergent evolution and analogous structures, you have different parts with a similar function.
Yep.
So again, bird wings, insect wings, similar function, but they're anatomically different. Versus divergent evolution and homologous structures, you're looking at a similar looking structure or part with a different function.
Absolutely.
So it's important to keep those two separate, but both of those kind of specifically convergent, divergent evolution kind of are what give us these trees and the similarities that we see across different species.
Absolutely.
And it's because of these similarities, especially that in divergent evolution with bat wings, human hands and whale flippers and other examples as well. It's because of those similarities that modern science argues that this shows descent from a common ancestor, because if all of these different functioning structures look anatomically the same, they have to be descendants of an organism that had that structure in the past. So that structures remain largely the same, but different functions have emerged for it according to mainstream science, and that, like I said, is used to suggest common ancestry.
Absolutely. Which becomes interesting because to some extent, evolution goes both ways. The argument for this in divergent evolution is, there's a similar structure that gets passed on, et cetera, et cetera. The question then becomes, where did that structure come from? And we had some of that discussion earlier in previous episodes with genetics and embryology development and what have you, where you're not just going to tack on an extra piece here and there and have it magically work. That's not how evolution has been shown to behave, and frankly, it's pretty clear that doesn't work the way people think it does. So it's interesting from the convergent divergent evolution side of things to say, this is going to get passed down. Okay, but where did that come from? which is a big question that evolution still has yet to answer.
And I think with both of these, we have to consider the role the environment plays on evolution as a whole. Natural selection is really a feature of the environment.
Evolution is a combination of genetics and ecology.
And one thing they tell you in genetics, or more specifically in the combination of both ecology and genetics, what we call population genetics, you hear a lot about the gene itself, the genetic information, plus the environment results in physical traits.
Or the phenotype.
So it's more specifically called genotype plus environmental effects or factors equals phenotype. Or what the genetic code says plus what the environment is equals what your physical traits are. And what we see is they all are going to have similar genetics in this case of divergent evolution with homologous structures, because they have a similar looking structure. But because of the environment, I think bats are arboreal and they fly. Humans, what we do, and whales, they live in the ocean.
Aquatic.
These traits are going, or these similar structures are going to have different functions because of the environment and the demands of the environment. A whale would not be able to get around if it had the human hand. They are similar, but they aren't exactly the same. There are some differences because of the environmental demand. So we see these different functions emerging largely in response to the environment. And the same thing can be said about convergent evolution. Completely different organisms living in the exact same environment are going to have to develop similar traits, similar adaptations to be able to survive in that environment. So a lot of evolution really goes back to the environment and how do organisms respond to the environment. And that's really what's driving this whole evolutionary process.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
When you look at these trees, you can see how that's happened over time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That actually brings up an interesting point, though, because obviously there is the idea with natural selection of survival of the fittest. You mentioned earlier, if you don't use it, you lose it, as the anatomy saying goes. What we do see in some organisms is we find what's called vestigial organs or vestigial structures, which are body parts or structures that no longer function, but are thought to be evidence of a common ancestor that did use them. A lot of people point to the human appendix being one of those, the tailbone, wisdom teeth, those types of things that once were useful and fully functional and needed for survival, but as evolution continued its course, they became redundant and not necessary.
Yeah, and with vestigial organs or vestigial structures, what we see is, again, going back to common ancestry, the original animal or organism had that structure and it was useful to that organism, but because over time, as descendants in their specific environment either no longer needed that or it maybe even became a detriment to that organism, eventually it got selected out of that population, and eventually we just see remnants of that structure that once had a function, and that's across a variety of different organisms, and we see these so-called vestigial organs. However, one thing we are also seeing is these structures that are thought to be vestigial, we're actually starting to find out that they're actually not.
And they do have a purpose still.
And exactly, they do have a purpose, and there are a couple that I like to point to, especially from a biblical worldview, of supposed vestigial structures that you would actually expect to be there from a biblical perspective. And the two main ones that I use are the appendix, as you mentioned, also the pelvis on a snake. So first of all, we'll look at the appendix. We'll talk about the appendix. We know now, just from studies, that the appendix does play a role in the immune system. While it's a minor role in the immune system, and one can live without it. If anybody listening has ever had appendicitis, I've not, you have not, but I hear it hurts very badly. And if you have appendicitis, you get it taken out. And you don't die after because you don't necessarily need to have your appendix. But what we're seeing now is those without an appendix are having a little bit of a little immunocompromised. Not heavily, but the appendix does have a small role in immunity.
And that's partially to do with its purpose in our microbiome, which is something that we'll get into in a later episode.
So at the very least, we're seeing that the appendix does have a function there. Even if it's a small function, it does have a purpose with immunity. But scientists also think that the appendix was once useful for breaking down plant matter and plant components. And this is going to come from humans in the past having a more plant-based diet that's more on herbs and vegetables and leafy greens and all those fun things. However, from a biblical perspective, this is exactly what we would expect, because in Genesis 1, we see that God gives, not really a command, but he says to all of life, including humans, that he gave all the green plants and their fruits to eat. So originally, humans were vegetarian. All they ate were plants. And that was a God-given thing as part of the original creation, that mankind in all of life consumed plant. And if that's the case, it would be expected that we would have this organ that was useful for breaking down plant material.
Same thing with wisdom teeth. Wisdom teeth are thought to be remnants of more plant use teeth shape.
And it wasn't until after the flood where God said that humans could then eat animal products, or meat more specifically. And as we've gone over the course of time, as humans have began to have a more omnivorous diet of both meat and plants, you would expect that function, again, going back to if you don't use it, you lose it, that function of the appendix of breaking down plant material is going to kind of regress, because we're not eating a solely plant-based diet anymore. Some people do, and that's fine. But for most of us who eat both meat and plants, it would be expected for us to have it would be expected that our appendix wouldn't have as much of a function in that regard. But we would still expect it to have had a function in the past, even with what this says, even if we don't use it for its original purpose. Because another thing with vestigial organs that we see is that the definition's kind of been changed. And in science, we see definitions change a lot. It's more changed now to be either something that no longer functions at all, or its function has changed from what it originally was. And as I said with the appendix, that aligns perfectly with the biblical worldview and what we'd expect from humans having a plant diet originally. And now we don't have a solely plant diet. So that function of the appendix has kind of regressed. And honestly, I kind of want to look into this now that I'm thinking about it. I'm curious if there's any studies on plant-based diets versus omnivorous diets and appendix function. But over the course of time, it wouldn't surprise me if even in those people who just have a plant-based diet, that the appendix really doesn't have that plant digestion function anymore. But like I said, we would expect it to have originally had that because of what we see in the Bible. And on the other side of my little ramble about vestigial structures with the snake pelvis, in Genesis chapter 3, we read where God cursed the serpent that tempted Eve, that the devil used to tempt Adam and Eve. We see God curse the serpent, saying, for the rest of your life, you will crawl on your belly. From this, we actually expect that snakes originally had legs and walked on legs. But because of the curse in the garden, snakes lost their legs, and from that, they now only crawl on their belly. But if that's the case, where they did originally have legs and God cursed them where they no longer have it, we could expect them to still have that structure, because originally God gave them the structure to have legs, which we would expect with pelvis. And modern science even says snakes originally had legs, and that's why that pelvis is there. And from a biblical side of things, if God originally gave the snake legs, we would expect him to have also given it a pelvis. But because of that curse in the garden, they no longer have legs, but that pelvis is still there because of his original design. There's other vestigial structures as well that we're seeing do actually have some sort of function. Maybe it's not the original function, but we are seeing a lot of what we're thought were once vestigial and useless actually does still have a purpose, even if taking it out of the system wouldn't destroy it or make it impossible to live. It still might create some sort of difficulty or some loss of proper function. Again, going back to the appendix, even though it's not needed to survive, you do lose a little bit of immunity there.
Quality of life is diminished without it.
Same thing with the spleen. The spleen has a role in immunity, but you can live without it. And there's other things as well you can live without. You can live with just one kidney. But why do we still have two kidneys? Because for full kidney function, you have two.
You can live without one eye. You can live without both eyes.
But that does put you at a significant disadvantage. And you got to consider, if we just lived in a wild environment, if an animal loses its eyes, it's going to be at a significant disadvantage. And one other thing I'll mention is the tailbone. We're seeing now that it has a role in posture. And sitting up.
And balance.
And I've never broke mine, but I've seen some things where a person broke their tailbone and they had trouble sitting up and balancing. It's a small part of the body, or the skeleton, but it still has a role in us being able to be upright. And the tailbone, just talking about it specifically, is thought to be remnants of our ancestors that had a tail. But now, because we lost that tail over evolutionary time, we still have the remnants of it in the tailbone. I always make this joke, you know how nice it would be to have a tail? We always have that problem. You're carrying in your groceries in both hands. You can't get your key in the door. Wouldn't it be nice to have a tail to be able to hold one of those sets of groceries so you could open the door? It'd be very useful, although that is assuming that our tail would be like that of a monkey that can actually hold on to things. But it's a joke and it's funny to think about. But the tailbone doesn't have to be the remnant of a tail. Like it still has function even if you don't even consider it as being the remnant of a tail. So overall, what we see is all these structures, similar, different things that change function over time. We're seeing all of that as the result of the role the environment played on life. And you can look all across the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, any of the other kingdoms of life, you can see how things have emerged traits or evolved traits for various things, just for living, for defense, whatever it may be. I mean, just thinking about plants, there's so many different types of leaves and stems and various other structures of the plant that are all for a variety of purposes, all help the plant survive. Mm-hmm. Same thing with animals.
Absolutely.
It's all about how the plant, or the animals, the plants, whatever, respond to the environment. And when those responses become unique from a different one, and those populations emerge or diverge, I guess is a better way to put it, that's when we see those new species emerging. And that's when we see those splits in those phylogeny trees.
Mm-hmm. And we've had the discussion before on this podcast that evolution does happen. We just don't think it happens to the extent of, oh, everything came from a bacteria and humans came from monkeys and so on and so forth. Divergent evolution is a thing. It does happen. There are splits in groups that cause one species and another. There are things that do happen like that. This is a real thing.
And we do see, as you mentioned, we see that speciation, and we see these similarities across the different groups. However, going back to what I mentioned last episode, we don't necessarily see the requirement to view that as the results of evolution.
Absolutely.
We see these similarities as an individual, a designer, using something that works across all of life. Mm-hmm. It made some tweaks here and there, as we see with homologous structures, to allow these organisms, these species, to live in their specific environment. But like I said before, there's really no need to create something completely different across.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
If it works, keep it.
And oh, by the way, back to the vestigial organs again. Everything has a place. There is a purpose for everything. We may not get it now, but there is a purpose for everything. Nothing is non-functional. There's a verse in Proverbs 16:4. One translation of it puts the verse as God made everything with a place and a purpose. Another translation says the Lord works everything to its own end. The vestigial organ that we think is just a remnant has a purpose and a function. Prior to the knowledge of, again, going back to the idea of the microbiome, prior to the knowledge that that even existed, the appendix was thought to be non-functional. How many other of these quote-unquote vestigial organs are similar in that there's just something we don't understand about its purpose or its process yet?
Yeah, and I will point out, this isn't coming from a stance of, oh, we don't understand it, therefore we have to invoke God. Mm-hmm. This is coming from a stance of we're invoking God in all of it. There are things that God has done and does on a regular basis that we'll never understand. And I think that includes with creation. We may not know what the purpose of some things are or why it's the way it is, but we know God is an intentional being. Everything he made with a purpose, he said it was very good in the beginning. So we can be sure that everything has a purpose one way or another, even if we can't figure it out. Mm-hmm. And like I said, I do think it's possible for those things to change over time. Again, going back to the curse in the garden, going back to us not eating solely plants anymore. Those things can change, but we do know that they had an original God-given purpose.
I think that's going to close us out for our discussion of evolution and homology. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Reconciliation Project podcast. We hope you'll join us next time as we discuss evolution in the fossil record, referring to missing links, what we've seen in the fossil record, and how that influences our opinions and the findings of evolution.